The police presence in Little Paddleton transformed the village overnight into something resembling a crime scene from one of those detective novels that Mrs. Ashford herself had been known to dismiss as common and sensational. Inspector Graves had set up temporary headquarters in the parish hall, requisitioning its largest room and its telephone line with the authority of a man accustomed to such impositions. By Wednesday morning, the preliminary toxicology report had confirmed what the constable's wife had suspected: arsenic administered in sufficient quantity to cause death within hours. The inspector's initial theory, presented to the assembled village dignitaries with the confidence of professional certainty, centered on Catherine's household staff and immediate family. Catherine had lived at Hazel with her son, Richard Ashford, a 48-year-old bachelor whose financial circumstances had become increasingly precarious in recent years, and his sister Patricia, who occupied the East Wing with her 2 children and a husband, perpetually engaged in some vague business venture in London. The servants comprised only 2 permanent residents: Mrs. Eleanor Fitton, the housekeeper of 20 years, and young Thomas Webb, employed as groundskeeper and general assistant for the past 3 years. The inspector interviewed each with meticulous thoroughness, noting their reactions, their inconsistencies, their nervous habits. Yet Miss Marple, observing the proceedings from a discreet distance, she had volunteered to assist the parish hall staff and thus maintained a legitimate presence, noticed something that seemed to escape the inspector's attention entirely. When Thomas Webb was questioned about his movements on the morning of Catherine's death, he had stated with considerable specificity that he had been pruning the roses in the south garden between 7 and 9 o'clock, tasks he performed every Tuesday without fail. His answer had been precise, perhaps too precise, the sort of precision that came from rehearsal rather than genuine recollection. Yet when the inspector pressed him on details, which roses, which section of the south garden, what tools he had employed, the young man's confidence wavered slightly, and he began to add qualifications to his account. Miss Marple, who knew gardens as intimately as she knew human nature, recognized the behavior of someone who had constructed an alibi rather than recalled a genuine activity. More intriguing still was Richard Ashford's demeanor during his interview. Catherine's son had inherited his mother's sharp features, but none of her force of personality. He was a thin, somewhat trembling man who had spent most of his adult life in his mother's shadow, serving as her unpaid secretary and social assistant while she managed the family's considerable estate and investments. The will, which the inspector obtained through Edmund Gray by Thursday morning, revealed that the estate would pass entirely to Patricia Ashford, with Richard receiving only a modest annuity, a circumstance that raised the inspector's eyebrows considerably. Yet what struck Miss Marple was not Richard's obvious financial motive, but rather his reaction to learning the contents of his mother's will. He had appeared not devastated or even shocked, but almost relieved, as though a burden he had carried for decades had suddenly been lifted. This was a man who had perhaps wished for his mother's death for years, not out of greed but out of a desperate desire for autonomy that Catherine had consistently denied him. Patricia Ashford presented an entirely different puzzle. She was a woman in her early 50s, once beautiful, and now beginning to show the strain of a marriage that had apparently never quite lived up to its promise. Her husband, Malcolm, maintained a studied distance from the village, appearing only when absolutely necessary and departing for London with visible relief. Patricia had lived at Hazel for 28 years, since her marriage to Richard, and in that time had maintained a facade of devoted daughter-in-law, while her actual relationship with Catherine had been marked by barely concealed resentment. She had, according to the village gossip that Miss Marple had carefully catalogued over the years, disagreed with Catherine about nearly everything: the upbringing of her children, the management of household finances, the propriety of various village activities. The inspector seemed inclined to view Patricia's motives as primarily financial. The inheritance would solve what seemed to be the Ashfords' chronic money troubles. Yet Miss Marple suspected something deeper. some personal wound that had festered for decades beneath layers of social courtesy. It was Eleanor Fitton, however, who presented the most puzzling case. The housekeeper had served Catherine loyally for 2 decades, managing the household with the kind of meticulous attention that only long service could produce. She had discovered Catherine's body that morning while bringing her usual 8 o'clock tea, and her initial shock had seemed genuine. Yet when Miss Marple encountered Eleanor in the parish hall kitchen on Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the arrangements for refreshments during the continued investigation, she noticed something curious. Eleanor wore a small locket around her neck, and her fingers repeatedly touched it with the unconscious habit of someone seeking reassurance from a beloved object. When Miss Marple, employing her characteristic technique of appearing to make idle conversation, mentioned how pleasant it was to see old keepsakes worn close to the heart, Eleanor's hand flew to the locket defensively, and her eyes betrayed a sudden, acute anxiety. By Friday morning, as Inspector Graves announced his intention to interview the Ashfords and their household staff a second time, Miss Marple had begun to construct a framework of understanding that differed markedly from the inspector's working theory. The poison in Catherine's tea suggested someone with access to her morning routine, someone familiar with her habits and her household. Yet familiarity with routine was not the same as motive, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that in village murders, the most obvious suspect was often not the guilty party, but merely the most convenient scapegoat. She had begun to think about Catherine's study, about the journals she had been reading at the moment of her death, and about what secrets those leather-bound volumes might contain. Secrets that someone in Little Paddleton had deemed worth killing to protect. Inspector Graves, demonstrating the professional thoroughness that had advanced his career through the ranks of the constabulary, had made one crucial decision that would ultimately prove to be both his greatest asset and his most significant limitation. He had sequestered Catherine's personal journals as potential evidence, locking them in a secure filing cabinet in the parish hall with the careful notation that they were to be examined for any references to threats, financial disputes, or personal conflicts that might illuminate motive. This decision, made with the best of intentions, had the unfortunate effect of removing from circulation precisely the materials that might have revealed the truth most efficiently. Yet Miss Marple, who had observed the constable's inventory procedures with her characteristic appearance of distracted helpfulness, had managed to note the precise location and security arrangements of these journals with the mental precision that belied her gentle demeanor. The second round of interviews began on Friday morning with Richard Ashford, and Miss Marple positioned herself in the adjacent room, ostensibly cataloguing tea service items for the parish hall, but in reality listening intently to the muffled conversation through the thin dividing wall. She heard the inspector's questions about Richard's financial situation, his relationship with his mother, his whereabouts on Tuesday morning. His answers were hesitant and contradictory in subtle ways that suggested not necessarily guilt, but rather a man unaccustomed to interrogation, frightened by authority, and struggling to present himself in the most favorable light. What interested Miss Marple far more, however, was what occurred during the afternoon session. At approximately 3 o'clock, just as Eleanor Fitton was being interviewed, a disturbance erupted in the village high street outside. Young Thomas Webb had been apprehended by the village constable attempting to board a bus bound for the county town, carrying with him a small rucksack and, most significantly, a considerable sum of money in used notes. The inspector, hearing of this development, had immediately suspended his interview with Eleanor and gone to investigate. By the time Thomas was brought to the parish hall under constable's escort, the entire village had learned of his attempted flight, and the collective certainty of his guilt had solidified into absolute conviction. Thomas Webb, when confronted with the evidence of his attempted escape, had crumbled almost immediately. He admitted to being in the house on Tuesday morning, admitted to having unusual access to Catherine's study, and under the inspector's persistent questioning, admitted to harboring resentment toward Catherine for her harsh treatment of him over his 3 years of employment. What he did not admit, despite increasingly aggressive interrogation, was to poisoning her tea. He maintained with stubborn consistency that he had seen Catherine alive at approximately 7:30 when she had summoned him to move a garden statue she had decided was positioned incorrectly. He had been in the study for perhaps 5 minutes, during which time Catherine had been in perfect health, complaining vociferously about the placement of the stone lion that now marked the east border of her rose garden. His attempted escape, he claimed with growing desperation, was entirely unrelated to Catherine's death. It was motivated by a personal matter he preferred not to discuss, and the money he carried was his own savings, accumulated over 3 years of careful economy. The inspector seemed prepared to dismiss Thomas's protestations entirely, viewing them as the transparent lies of a frightened criminal attempting to avoid a capital charge. Yet Miss Marple, observing Thomas's face as he maintained his innocence, saw something that the inspector's professional skepticism had rendered invisible. She saw genuine fear, yes, but not the fear of a man caught in his crime. She saw the fear of a man confronting a catastrophe entirely beyond his control, the fear of someone watching his life collapse under the weight of circumstantial evidence that seemed to point inescapably toward his guilt. It was this distinction, subtle but crucial, that caused Miss Marple to begin reconsidering the entire structure of the investigation. By Friday evening, as Thomas Webb was formally charged with Catherine Ashford's murder and remanded to custody pending trial, the village had settled into a state of satisfied closure. Justice appeared to have been served, the criminal apprehended, the community restored to its proper order. Yet Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden room, her knitting temporarily abandoned on her lap, and thought about gardens and gardeners and the precise movements of a young man on a Tuesday morning. She thought about Eleanor Fitton's locket and the defensive anxiety that had flickered across the housekeeper's face. She thought about Richard Ashford's apparent relief at his mother's death and Patricia Ashford's barely concealed resentment. Most significantly, she thought about Catherine's journals, locked away in the parish hall, containing secrets that had apparently been worth protecting with extreme prejudice. On Saturday morning, Miss Marple made a decision that was entirely uncharacteristic of her generally cautious approach to life. She arranged for a private meeting with Inspector Graves, ostensibly to discuss the parish hall's needs following the investigation's conclusion. When they were alone in his temporary office, surrounded by the paperwork of his investigation, Miss Marple seated herself with careful deliberation and addressed the inspector with a directness that took him by surprise. She suggested, with the gentle but unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, that Thomas Webb's guilt was perhaps not as certain as the evidence suggested, and that the journals Catherine Ashford had been reading at the moment of her death might contain information crucial to understanding the true nature of the crime. The inspector, accustomed to the interference of amateur detectives in village murders, was prepared to dismiss her concerns with professional courtesy. Yet something in Miss Marple's bearing, some quality of absolute conviction born of decades of accurate observation, gave him pause. Inspector Graves was not a man given to second-guessing his professional judgment. Yet Miss Marple possessed a quality that transcended the usual category of interfering amateur sleuth. Her reputation in Little Paddleton was that of a woman whose observations about human nature had proven accurate with almost uncanny frequency over many decades. More significantly, her demeanor suggested not the meddling enthusiasm of an amateur detective, but rather the measured conviction of someone who had observed something concrete that the official investigation had overlooked. With visible reluctance, but also with the pragmatism of a career policeman who recognized that consulting with local expertise occasionally yielded surprising results, the inspector authorized Miss Marple to examine Catherine's journals under his direct supervision. The journals themselves, when retrieved from their secure filing cabinet, proved to be a fascinating chronicle of Catherine Ashford's private thoughts spanning the past 5 years. They were bound in burgundy leather, filled with Catherine's precise handwriting and organized chronologically with the meticulous care that seemed to characterize every aspect of her life. What emerged from reading these intimate records was a portrait of a woman far more complex and conflicted than her public persona suggested. Catherine had been not merely domineering, but actively, deliberately manipulative in her family relationships. Her entries detailed calculated decisions to withhold approval from Richard, strategic maneuvers designed to keep Patricia financially dependent and emotionally subordinate, and carefully orchestrated social cruelties disguised as maternal concern. Yet these manipulations had not brought Catherine satisfaction. Instead, they had filled her private thoughts with a gnawing anxiety about her own legacy and the affection, or lack thereof, that her family harbored toward her. What truly captured Miss Marple's attention, however, were the entries from the past 6 months. Beginning approximately in April, Catherine's tone had shifted dramatically. The confident dominance gave way to something approaching fear, though Catherine had disguised this fear beneath layers of righteous indignation. She wrote repeatedly of having discovered something disturbing and deeply troubling regarding someone close to her. She referenced betrayal of the most fundamental sort and made cryptic mentions of evidence that cannot be ignored and actions that must be taken. Most significantly, in an entry dated merely 3 weeks prior to her death, Catherine had written, "I've confirmed my suspicions beyond any reasonable doubt. The deception is complete and has been ongoing for years. I must now determine how to proceed, knowing that revelation will cause considerable suffering, yet knowing also that concealment makes me complicit in great injustice. My duty is clear, though the path forward fills me with dread." The inspector, reading over Miss Marple's shoulder, began to appreciate the subtle significance of these entries. They suggested that Catherine had discovered something so troubling that it had overcome her usual patterns of thought and forced her toward some decisive action. The question became, what had she discovered, and toward whom had she intended to direct this revelation? Miss Marple, however, noticed something in the journals that the inspector had not yet registered with full significance. Throughout the entries, Catherine made repeated reference to the correspondence and the letters I have discovered. She mentioned having found materials hidden behind the Hazel door of the study, a curious phrasing that referred to the small mahogany cabinet with hazelwood inlay that stood in Catherine's study, a piece of furniture that had belonged to the brigadier and which Catherine had apparently never fully explored until recently. The inspector immediately ordered a thorough search of this cabinet, which was brought to the parish hall and carefully examined. Behind its false back panel, which required considerable effort to dislodge, lay a collection of letters spanning more than 2 decades. These were not ordinary correspondence. They were deeply personal communications between 2 individuals whose relationship had clearly been both passionate and clandestine. The handwriting on several of the letters was unmistakably Eleanor Fitton's. The letters revealed a long-standing romantic relationship between Eleanor and the late Brigadier Ashford, a relationship that had apparently begun shortly after Eleanor's employment at Hazel Door and had continued, with varying intensity, until the Brigadier's death 5 years previously. More significantly, the letters made explicit reference to a child born of this relationship approximately 23 years prior, a child who had been placed in Eleanor's sister's care and raised away from the village. The dates, when cross-referenced with village records and Eleanor's own employment history, made clear that Eleanor had taken a temporary leave of absence from her position at precisely the time when such a birth would have occurred. Catherine's notes, written in the margins of some of these letters, made her shock and moral outrage abundantly apparent. She had written such phrases as, "To think I harbored this deception in my own home," and "that she dare show her face in my household, and most damningly, I cannot allow this outrage to continue unchecked. The child, now grown, must be informed of his true parentage. Justice demands nothing less." The inspector's understanding of the case had shifted dramatically. Eleanor Fitton, far from being merely a loyal employee, had been revealed as someone whose entire life was constructed upon a carefully maintained deception. She had lived for more than 2 decades in Catherine's household, harboring a profound secret, knowing that if it were ever revealed, her reputation would be destroyed and her position rendered untenable. When Catherine had discovered the correspondence and made clear her intention to publicize these facts, Eleanor's entire existence had been placed in jeopardy. The motive for murder had suddenly become crystal clear. Yet as Miss Marple continued to examine the letters with meticulous attention, she noticed something that caused her to pause and turn toward the inspector with an expression of troubled contemplation. The most recent letters in the collection, those dated within the past year, contained a handwriting that bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor's, but was distinctly different. Slightly more hurried, the spacing inconsistent. Certain letters formed differently than Eleanor's established patterns. Someone else had been writing letters in Eleanor's hand, imitating her characteristic style with reasonable accuracy, but imperfect execution. The inspector, whose professional training had prepared him for many contingencies but not necessarily for the subtle nuances of handwriting analysis, initially regarded Miss Marple's observation with the polite skepticism of someone who suspected he was being led down a path of unnecessary complication. Yet Miss Marple, with the patient determination of someone who had spent decades studying the minutiae of human behavior and its physical manifestations, insisted upon a more rigorous examination. She requested that samples of Eleanor's established handwriting be compared with the questionable letters, and she suggested that the inspector contact a handwriting expert from the county town to provide professional analysis. This consultation, arranged for Monday morning, would confirm what Miss Marple had already intuited. The recent letters had been written by someone other than Eleanor Fitton, someone who had studied her handwriting with sufficient care to produce a reasonable facsimile but who lacked the unconscious consistency that characterized authentic personal handwriting. This revelation necessitated a complete reconstruction of the investigation's foundation. If Eleanor had not written the recent letters, then the question became, who had? The inspector, chastened by his near-catastrophic misinterpretation of the evidence, approached the problem with renewed methodical care. The letters had been hidden in the brigadier's cabinet for decades, yet someone had recently accessed them and added new correspondence to the collection. This someone would have needed intimate knowledge of Eleanor's personal history, access to her writing samples, and motivation to forge these letters and ensure their discovery by Catherine Ashford. The implications were staggering. It suggested premeditation of an extraordinarily sophisticated nature, a plan designed not merely to commit murder, but to ensure that suspicion fell upon Eleanor Fitton. Thomas Webb's attempted escape and his subsequent arrest now appeared in an entirely different light. The young man had been positioned perfectly as a convenient suspect, someone with access to the household, sufficient motive through Catherine's harsh treatment, and a circumstantial connection to her death. Yet his panic and attempted flight might have been motivated not by guilt, but by recognition of a danger he could sense but not articulate, the danger of being trapped in circumstances that would inevitably lead to his conviction. Miss Marple requested a second meeting with Eleanor Fitton, conducted this time with considerably more compassion than the inspector's previous interrogations had displayed. When Eleanor was brought to the parish hall and informed of the handwriting analysis, of the forged letters, and of her consequent exoneration from suspicion in Catherine's death, the housekeeper's reaction was profound. She collapsed into a chair, her composure shattering entirely, and wept with the intensity of someone experiencing simultaneously relief from one burden and the crushing weight of another. Through her tears, Eleanor confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions regarding the brigadier's child. She had indeed borne a son to the late brigadier, a child placed in the care of her sister in a neighboring county and raised away from Little Paddleton. The child, now grown into a man of 23 years, bore his mother's distinctive features and his father's aristocratic bearing. He had been given the name David Ashford, ostensibly Eleanor's sister's surname, and had been told that his father was a man who had died before his birth. Eleanor had maintained contact with her son through carefully managed letters and occasional visits conducted with elaborate secrecy. No one in the village, to her knowledge, was aware of his existence. Yet as Eleanor spoke, Miss Marple's mind began to construct a framework that suggested otherwise. Someone had known about the son. Someone had been aware of the hidden correspondence. Someone had possessed both the knowledge and the motivation to forge these letters and position them where Catherine Ashford would inevitably discover them. The implications were chilling in their calculated cruelty. On Tuesday morning, the inspector brought Patricia Ashford in for a more intensive interview. When confronted with the evidence regarding the forged letters, and with the suggestion that someone close to the family had orchestrated Catherine's death through an elaborate scheme designed to implicate both Eleanor and the innocent Thomas Webb, Patricia initially maintained her composure. Yet when the inspector presented handwriting samples of her correspondence against the forged letters, Patricia's carefully constructed facade began to crack. She denied involvement with a vehemence that suggested not innocence, but rather the desperation of someone whose elaborate plan was unraveling before her eyes. The inspector pressed harder, presenting the financial motive, the inheritance that would solve the Ashfords' considerable debts, alongside the discovery that Patricia had, through her husband's business contacts, maintained connections with a handwriting forger employed in London for purposes of document fraud. Patricia's denials became increasingly incoherent, her carefully rehearsed explanations collapsing under the weight of accumulated evidence. Yet she continued to insist, with an intensity that suggested genuine conviction, that she had not poisoned Catherine. She acknowledged the forged letters, acknowledged her intention to frame Eleanor for the crime, but vehemently denied administering the arsenic. It was this adamant assertion, paradoxically, that caused Miss Marple to pause and reconsider the entire structure of the case once more. For if Patricia had orchestrated the forging of the letters and carefully positioned the evidence to incriminate Eleanor, if she had indeed harbored both motive and opportunity to poison her mother-in-law, why would she now deny the actual poisoning while confessing to the infinitely more complex scheme of framing an innocent person? Miss Marple's keen observation of human nature suggested that people accused of crimes typically denied everything, or confessed everything, or constructed elaborate partial truths. They rarely admitted to one crime while adamantly denying another equally culpable offense. This inconsistency suggested the possibility of a truth far more complex than the investigation had yet uncovered. Miss Marple requested a private conversation with the inspector, conducted away from the observation of other officers and away from the carefully controlled environment of the parish hall interview room. In the quiet of the adjoining office, with the afternoon light filtering through the windows in long, golden streams, Miss Marple presented her observations with the clarity of someone who had spent decades distilling complex human motivations into comprehensible patterns. She suggested that Patricia Ashford, while certainly guilty of orchestrating an elaborate scheme to frame Eleanor Fitton, might not be guilty of administering the poison. She proposed, instead, that Patricia had constructed her plan with a specific individual in mind, an individual she believed would benefit from Eleanor's conviction and whose interests aligned sufficiently with her own that she believed he would remain silent regarding her complicity. The inspector, initially skeptical, began to understand the terrible elegance of Miss Marple's theory. Patricia had forged the letters and ensured their discovery by Catherine, knowing that Catherine's moral outrage would compel her to expose Eleanor's secret. She had positioned Eleanor as the obvious suspect, someone with clear motive, the preservation of her decades-long secret, and with household access to Catherine's morning tea. Yet Patricia had not herself administered the poison. Instead, she had trusted that someone else, motivated by his own compelling reasons, would commit the actual murder, while Patricia remained safely positioned as merely the orchestrator of a frame-up rather than a murderer. The question then became, who was this individual, and what was his motivation? The answer, when it emerged, came not from interrogation, but from a telephone call received by the inspector on Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor's sister, alarmed by rumors circulating in her own village regarding Eleanor's involvement in a murder investigation, had contacted the police to establish the facts. During this conversation, she mentioned that her son, Eleanor's biological son, had recently come into contact with someone from Little Paddleton, someone who had been providing him with information about his true parentage and his potential inheritance rights as the unacknowledged son of the late Brigadier Ashford. This revelation struck the inspector with the force of sudden illumination. He immediately requested that David Ashford be brought to the parish hall for questioning, and he contacted Patricia Ashford to inform her of this development. Patricia's reaction was one of complete panic. When brought face to face with the knowledge that her carefully constructed plan had unraveled, that the individual she believed she had manipulated had in fact been manipulating her, Patricia's composure disintegrated entirely. She confessed to forging the letters, to plotting Eleanor's incrimination, to believing that Eleanor would be convicted and that she herself would inherit Catherine's estate without suspicion. Yet she maintained, with desperate insistence, that she had not poisoned Catherine. She claimed instead that Richard Ashford had done so, that Richard had learned of her plan through overheard conversations, and that Richard had seized upon the opportunity to commit the murder while blame would fall upon Eleanor. When brought to the parish hall for questioning, Richard Ashford presented an entirely different picture from the trembling, uncertain man who had been interviewed in the initial stages of the investigation. Confronted with Patricia's accusation and with the evidence of the forged letters, Richard's demeanor changed dramatically. His nervous hesitation gave way to something approaching contempt, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a weight of barely suppressed rage that shocked everyone present. He confirmed Patricia's account, but reframed it entirely. Yes, he said, he had learned of Patricia's plan. Yes, he had administered the arsenic to his mother's morning tea. But he had done so not as Patricia's unwitting tool, but as a deliberate actor following his own carefully considered logic. Richard had harbored resentment toward his mother for decades, he explained with cold clarity. She had controlled every aspect of his life, denied him autonomy, refused to allow him to establish himself as an independent adult. Her domination had been absolute and, in Richard's estimation, psychologically devastating. He had long since determined that he could not live a genuine life while Catherine remained alive. Patricia's plan had simply provided him with an opportunity he had been waiting for throughout his entire adult existence. Yet Richard's confession created a new complication. If Richard had poisoned Catherine, what role had Eleanor's son, David Ashford, played in the sequence of events? The investigation had suggested his involvement, yet the actual poisoning appeared to have been Richard's work. It was Miss Marple who, upon careful questioning of both Patricia and Richard, identified the final layer of the crime's complex architecture. David Ashford had indeed been contacted by Patricia, who had learned of his existence through her husband's London business connections and who believed that bringing David into contact with the poisoned truth of his parentage would provide additional psychological motivation for Eleanor's conviction. A man's testimony regarding his mother's decades-long deception would carry considerable weight with a jury. Yet David, when confronted with the knowledge of his true parentage, had experienced something entirely unexpected. Rather than accepting Patricia's narrative or seeking revenge against Eleanor, David had been struck by the profound moral complexity of the situation. He had attempted to warn Eleanor of the danger she faced, but his warning had come too late. Catherine had already discovered the letters. Richard had already resolved upon murder, and the machinery of conspiracy had already been set in motion. David's ultimate role in the sequence of events had been neither criminal nor conspiratorial, but tragically, frustratingly powerless. He had attempted to prevent the catastrophe, but had possessed neither the information nor the authority to do so. The complexity of the crime that had emerged from the investigation's careful reconstruction bore little resemblance to the straightforward narrative that had initially seemed so evident. What had appeared to be a simple poisoning committed by a disgruntled employee in a fit of desperate self-preservation had instead revealed itself to be a layered conspiracy involving multiple actors, each pursuing their own objectives while remaining partially ignorant of the other's intentions. The inspector, humbled by the case's intricacy and grateful for Miss Marple's crucial interventions, began the process of formal charges and legal proceedings. Richard Ashford was charged with murder, his confession providing the fundamental evidence upon which the prosecution's case would rest. Patricia Ashford faced charges of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice through her orchestration of the forged letters and her deliberate positioning of Eleanor Fitton as a false suspect. David Ashford, after considerable legal deliberation, was not charged with any offense, his attempted warning to Eleanor deemed insufficient grounds for criminal complicity. Thomas Webb, the innocent young man whose attempted escape had so thoroughly convinced the inspector of his guilt, was formally exonerated and released from custody with a formal apology from the constabulary. Yet the restoration of legal order did not bring the uncomplicated closure that the village had anticipated. The crimes that had been committed, the deceptions that had been revealed, and the family relationships that had been shattered created an aftermath of profound psychological disturbance that lingered long after the immediate legal proceedings had concluded. Eleanor Fitton, her decades-long secret exposed to the entire village, resigned her position at Hazel door and departed Little Paddleton to reunite with her son in his own community. Her departure was marked by a complex mixture of village emotions, sympathy for her suffering, judgment regarding her moral transgression, and a certain discomfited recognition that her situation reflected human complications that did not fit neatly into categories of right and wrong. David Ashford remained in Little Paddleton for several weeks following his mother's departure, attempting to process the bewildering confluence of his newfound family connections and the trauma of having been positioned, however inadvertently, as a weapon in Patricia's conspiracy. He visited Eleanor frequently, the two of them beginning the difficult process of establishing a genuine relationship that transcended the biological fact of their connection and encompassed genuine emotional understanding. Richard Ashford awaited trial in the county jail, maintaining throughout the preliminary legal proceedings an attitude of cold, almost serene acceptance. He displayed neither remorse for his crime nor defensive anger regarding his fate. Instead, he seemed to regard his forthcoming trial with an expression of completed purpose, as though the act of murdering his mother had represented the culmination of a long, internal journey rather than a sudden, desperate impulse. The village itself struggled to process the revelations that had emerged from the investigation. The comfortable certainties about social positions, family loyalty, and the fundamental decency of familiar faces had been thoroughly disrupted. People who had known Richard Ashford since childhood now regarded him with a mixture of horror and reluctant comprehension. They recognized in his account of his mother's domination a pathology that had been visible in the family dynamics for decades, but which no one had been willing to name openly. Similarly, Catherine Ashford's reputation, which had rested upon her charitable works and her social prominence, was now complicated by the recognition of her manipulative nature and her willingness to wield knowledge as a weapon of control. Miss Marple, in the weeks following the resolution of the case, found herself the subject of considerable attention from the village. Neighbors who had previously regarded her as merely a pleasant elderly woman engaged in knitting and tending her garden now recognized her as someone possessed of extraordinary powers of observation and deduction. This recognition brought with it a certain social elevation, yet also a subtle wariness. People became conscious that Miss Marple's kind smile and gentle inquiries might mask a penetrating assessment of their own behaviors and secrets. She found herself treated with a deference that bordered on caution, as though villagers were uncertain whether her pleasant exterior concealed a judge of their moral character. It was this subtle shift in her social position that prompted Miss Marple to spend considerable time in reflection regarding the nature of her observations and their ethical implications. She sat in her garden room on a clear October afternoon, the autumn light lending a golden quality to the familiar landscape, and considered the strange burden of accurate perception. She had seen truths that others had overlooked, had recognized patterns in behavior that seemed invisible to those trained in more conventional investigative methods. Yet this facility for observation came with a responsibility that was not always comfortable. She had possessed knowledge that, if shared earlier or differently, might have prevented certain tragedies. She had remained silent during portions of the investigation because she had not been entirely certain of her conclusions, and this silence, while strategically sound, carried with it a moral weight that she could not entirely dismiss. The village gradually returned to its ordinary rhythms, though with an undercurrent of disquiet that would persist for years. The church resumed its regular functions. The post office continued to serve as the center of local gossip, and the seasonal cycles of agricultural life proceeded with their usual indifference to human drama. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the collective consciousness of little Paddleton. The comfortable illusion that such places represented havens of security and moral certainty had been thoroughly disrupted. People had learned, through the terrible medium of murder and conspiracy, that ordinary communities harbored the same capacities for deception, violence, and moral complexity that characterized larger, more obviously turbulent environments. Miss Marple, observing this subtle transformation of her village's collective consciousness, recognized it as a necessary, if painful, maturation. The trial of Richard Ashford, conducted in the county assizes during the grey weeks of November, presented a curious spectacle of legal drama that both confirmed and complicated the narrative that the investigation had constructed. The prosecution's case rested primarily upon Richard's own confession, supplemented by the forensic evidence of arsenic in Catherine's tea and the testimony of household staff regarding the household's routines and relationships. The defense, recognizing the virtual impossibility of securing an acquittal given the weight of evidence, instead pursued a strategy of psychological mitigation, presenting expert testimony regarding the long-term psychological effects of maternal domination and the potential for such domination to create conditions of extreme emotional disturbance that might impair judgment and diminish culpability. Miss Marple attended the trial's proceedings, seated in the public gallery alongside other interested villagers and journalists from the regional newspapers who had been drawn to the case by its unusual complexity. She observed Richard throughout the trial with the careful attention of someone watching a final confirmation of judgments already formed. What struck her most forcefully was Richard's demeanor during his testimony when the prosecution asked him to recount the events of the morning of Catherine's death and his motivations for committing the poisoning. Richard described his actions with almost clinical precision, detailing how he had obtained the arsenic through a contact in the London business sphere, how he had carefully measured the dosage to ensure rapid, but not suspiciously, immediate death, and how he had administered it to his mother's morning tea while she was momentarily distracted by correspondence. He did not attempt to minimize his actions or to present himself as sympathetic. Instead, he spoke with an unsettling rationality that seemed to deeply unsettle the jury members, who had perhaps expected remorse or at least some acknowledgement of the gravity of his crime. When the prosecution asked Richard whether he had any regrets regarding his actions, Richard responded with words that would later be quoted extensively in newspaper accounts of the trial. "I regret that I did not act sooner. For 30 years, my mother controlled every aspect of my existence, denied me the opportunity to develop as an independent person, and structured her entire life around the exercise of dominion over mine. I should have acted at 20, not at 48. The only regret I experience is the waste of 3 decades of my adult life spent in a state of psychological servitude." This statement, rather than evoking sympathy, seemed to crystallize for the jury the fundamental incompatibility between Richard's rational justification for his crime and the moral and legal standards by which such crimes were necessarily judged. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty, and the judge, in his sentencing remarks, made clear his view that Richard Ashford had committed a calculated murder motivated by personal resentment rather than by any genuine emergency or proportionate response to provocation. Richard was sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence he received with the same expression of serene acceptance that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial. As he was led from the courtroom, he turned briefly toward the gallery, and his eyes, for just a moment, seemed to focus directly upon Miss Marple. Whether this was intentional recognition or merely coincidence, Miss Marple could not determine with certainty, but the moment unsettled her in ways she found difficult to articulate. The trial's conclusion brought a formal ending to the legal proceedings, yet it did not bring complete closure to the emotional and psychological dimensions of the crime. Patricia Ashford, facing charges of conspiracy, entered into negotiations with the prosecution that ultimately resulted in her conviction on reduced charges in exchange for her testimony regarding her knowledge of Richard's intentions. She received a suspended sentence, a disposition that generated considerable criticism from certain segments of the village population who felt that her orchestration of the false frame-up against Eleanor Fitton warranted more substantial punishment. Patricia and her husband Malcolm departed Little Paddleton within weeks of the trial's conclusion. Their financial situation ironically improved by Catherine's estate, which passed to Patricia as the surviving spouse of Richard Ashford, since Richard's conviction did not automatically divest him of inheritance rights. The sale of Hazel and the dispersal of Catherine's extensive collection of property and investments generated a small fortune that Patricia clearly intended to enjoy in locations distant from the scenes of her recent conspiracies. David Ashford's situation evolved in unexpected directions. Following Eleanor's departure from the village and his own processing of the traumatic events surrounding his introduction to his biological family, David made the decision to establish himself more permanently in Little Paddleton. He sought and obtained employment with a local solicitor, thus securing a legitimate position in the village's professional structure. His relationship with Eleanor, conducted through correspondence and periodic visits, gradually developed into something approaching genuine filial affection. He visited his mother every fortnight, the two of them gradually constructing a relationship that transcended the biological accident of his birth and encompassed genuine emotional connection. Thomas Webb, the innocent young man whose attempted escape had so thoroughly convinced the initial investigation of his guilt, struggled considerably with the psychological aftermath of his false accusation and imprisonment. Though formally exonerated and presented with a modest financial settlement by the local authority in compensation for his wrongful detention, Thomas found it difficult to re-establish himself in the village community. The fact of his near conviction lingered in villagers' minds, a persistent shadow that never quite dissipated despite the formal establishment of his innocence. Within 6 months of his release, Thomas made the decision to leave Little Paddleton, accepting a position as groundskeeper at a country estate in another county, where his past was not known and where he might attempt to reconstruct his life without the perpetual reminder of having been almost condemned for a crime he did not commit. Miss Marple, observing these various resolutions and departures, found herself contemplating the often incomplete nature of justice and resolution in human affairs. The guilty had been identified and punished according to law, yet the innocent had suffered, and the community had been fractured in ways that legal processes could not fully repair. It was in December, as Little Paddleton settled into the particular atmosphere of the approaching holiday season, that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor at her cottage. Inspector Graves arrived on a clear, cold afternoon, his official demeanor softened by something approaching genuine friendliness born of their collaboration during the investigation. He came bearing tea and biscuits, a gesture of social courtesy that suggested his visit was not primarily professional in nature. And he seated himself in Miss Marple's familiar garden room with the ease of someone who had come to regard her as a trusted confidant. The inspector began by expressing his formal gratitude for Miss Marple's crucial contributions to the investigation's resolution. He acknowledged that without her recognition of the handwriting inconsistencies, without her intuitive understanding of human psychology that had guided him away from Patricia Ashford as the primary suspect and toward the more complex truth regarding Richard's central role, the case might well have concluded with an innocent woman convicted of murder and a guilty man remaining free to pursue whatever dark designs his psyche harbored. Yet as their conversation progressed, moving from professional matters into more personal territory, the inspector revealed the true purpose of his visit. He had been reflecting, he explained, upon the nature of his investigative methodology and upon how thoroughly his conventional training had initially led him astray in this case. He had begun to question whether the systematic, forensic approach that formed the foundation of modern detective work was inherently superior to the kind of intuitive, psychologically grounded observation that Miss Marple had demonstrated. He asked with genuine intellectual curiosity, rather than rhetorical posturing, how she had developed such extraordinary facility for reading human behavior and motivation. Miss Marple, characteristically modest in her response, suggested that her abilities were nothing particularly extraordinary, but rather the natural result of living in a community for many decades and paying careful attention to the patterns by which human beings revealed their true natures through their actions and reactions. She suggested that people were, in her observation, remarkably consistent in their fundamental characteristics across time and circumstance. The behaviors that revealed a person's core nature, their responses to stress, their patterns of deception, their capacity for self-awareness, or alternatively their self-deception, remained essentially constant throughout their lives, merely expressing themselves through different vehicles and contexts. She explained, simply spent decades observing these patterns in the village context and had learned to recognize their manifestations across different situations and different individuals. The inspector listened to this explanation with evident fascination, and he then posed a question that seemed to have been troubling him throughout the investigation's resolution. Miss Marple, I must ask you directly. At what point during the investigation did you become convinced of Richard Ashford's guilt? Was it when we discovered the forged letters, or did you suspect him earlier? Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful deliberation before responding. She explained that she had harbored suspicions regarding Richard earlier than the evidence might have warranted. She had observed during the initial interviews that Richard's apparent relief at his mother's death seemed disproportionate to what one might expect even from someone who had harbored resentment. Relief, in her experience, typically manifested in subtle physical relaxations and a certain lightening of the facial muscles, the kind of unconscious response that people could not entirely control. Yet Richard's relief had seemed almost theatrical, as though he had been so thoroughly prepared for the outcome that the actual event itself had merely confirmed what he had long since accepted as inevitable. Furthermore, she had noted his reaction to learning the contents of Catherine's will. Most individuals facing an unexpected but disadvantageous change in their financial circumstances would register shock or disappointment. Richard, by contrast, had seemed almost to have anticipated this outcome, as though the will's contents had simply confirmed expectations that he had already formed. These subtle indicators, when considered together with his obvious psychological burden under his mother's domination, had suggested to Miss Marple that Richard possessed both motive and the psychological capacity to commit premeditated murder. Yet she had not voiced these suspicions to the inspector until the evidence regarding the forged letters had created an opening for reinterpretation of the case's fundamental structure. The inspector nodded thoughtfully, and then he broached a topic that seemed to cause him considerable discomfort. He mentioned that he had been contacted by Scotland Yard regarding several other cases that had generated unusual circumstances or had proven resistant to conventional investigative approaches. Representatives from the Metropolitan Police had expressed interest in consulting with Miss Marple regarding her observational methods and her capacity for psychological analysis. They had suggested, with considerable delicacy, that she might consider establishing a consultancy relationship with law enforcement agencies that would allow her to contribute her expertise to investigations beyond the immediate boundaries of Little Paddleton. Miss Marple's response to this proposal was immediate and unambiguous. She expressed appreciation for the recognition of her contributions to the Richard Ashford investigation, but she declined the proposal entirely. She explained that her effectiveness as an observer of human nature was inextricably bound to her deep knowledge of a specific community developed over decades of intimate social observation. She suggested that applying her methods to investigations involving strangers in unfamiliar contexts would likely prove futile, as her insights depended fundamentally upon understanding the particular social structures, histories, and psychological patterns that characterized a specific place and population. Furthermore, she noted that she had entered her later years with the intention of gradually reducing her involvement in the serious and often disturbing business of investigating human crime. She preferred to spend her remaining years in quiet contemplation of her village and its people, observing their lives and their characters without the burden of responsibility that accompanied active involvement in criminal investigation. The inspector accepted this response with visible disappointment, but also with apparent understanding. As he prepared to depart, he expressed once more his gratitude and his hope that perhaps future circumstances might bring them into professional collaboration again. Miss Marple responded with characteristic warmth, but also with gentle finality, suggesting that some chapters of one's life, once concluded, were best left closed rather than reopened. The departure of Inspector Graves left Miss Marple in a state of quiet contemplation that extended through the remainder of December and into the new year that followed. She found herself reflecting upon the case with a frequency and intensity that suggested unfinished psychological business despite the formal resolution of all legal proceedings and the dispersal of the principal actors to their various destinations. There was something about the Catherine Ashford case that refused to settle into the comfortable category of completed investigations, something that gnawed at the periphery of Miss Marple's consciousness with the persistence of an unresolved chord in music. She recognized this restlessness as stemming not from any doubt regarding the factual accuracy of the investigation's conclusions. Richard's guilt was beyond reasonable question, but rather from a deeper philosophical disquiet regarding the nature of the crime itself and the circumstances that had generated it. In early January, as the village emerged from the festivities of the holiday season and resumed its ordinary rhythms, Miss Marple made a decision that surprised even herself. She composed a letter to Richard Ashford, incarcerated in the county prison awaiting transfer to a permanent penal institution, requesting permission to visit him. Her stated purpose was vague. She described it as a desire to complete her understanding of the case's emotional dimensions, but her true motivation was more complicated and less entirely explicable. She had experienced something during the trial when Richard's eyes had seemed to focus upon her across the courtroom gallery, and she had begun to wonder whether Richard himself harbored reflections regarding the investigation that might prove illuminating to her own understanding of the crime's genesis. Richard's response to her request was surprisingly prompt. He indicated his willingness to receive Miss Marple's visit, and indeed seemed to welcome the prospect. When Miss Marple arrived at the county prison on a cold January afternoon, she found herself face to face with Richard in a small visitation room, separated by a table and observed by a prison officer stationed discreetly in the corner. Richard's demeanor had shifted subtly since the trial's conclusion. The serene acceptance that had characterized his courtroom testimony had given way to something approaching genuine engagement with his circumstances. He greeted Miss Marple with courtesy that suggested he understood the significance of her visit and appreciated the effort required for an elderly woman to journey to the prison. Miss Marple began by asking Richard to reflect upon the events that had led to his crime, not from a legal or factual perspective, but from the perspective of his own internal psychological experience. She asked him to describe, if he could articulate it, the moment when his mother's domination had transformed from a pattern he endured into something that seemed intolerable and demanding of violent response. Richard's response was thoughtful and remarkably introspective. He explained that there had been no singular moment of transformation, but rather a gradual accumulation of small humiliations and denials that had eventually crystallized into a recognition that his life would never be his own unless he took decisive action. He described the particular horror of reaching middle age while still requiring his mother's permission to make decisions about his daily existence. He spoke of his awareness that time was running out, that aging would render him progressively less capable of establishing independence, and that his mother's death would eventually come, but perhaps not until he himself was too old to enjoy the freedom it would provide. The decision to poison her, he explained, had emerged from a terrible clarity regarding the only possible path to autonomy that remained available to him. Yet as Richard spoke, Miss Marple observed something in his expression that suggested his earlier stated satisfaction with his crime had been perhaps partly performative, a construction designed to provide psychological coherence to an act that was fundamentally incoherent and self-destructive. Now facing the reality of life imprisonment, Richard seemed to be experiencing the delayed emotional consequences of his action. Not remorse exactly, but rather a growing recognition of the terrible futility of his crime. He had murdered his mother to obtain freedom, only to exchange that freedom for the absolute constraint of imprisonment. The irony of this outcome seemed to have penetrated his psychological defenses, leaving him face to face with the recognition that his act had solved nothing and had instead merely transformed one kind of captivity into another, more permanent variety. Miss Marple asked him whether he had anticipated this outcome, whether on some level he had recognized that murder would inevitably lead to his own incarceration. Richard's response was honest in a way that suggested his earlier theatrical acceptance had given way to genuine self-examination. He acknowledged that he had not truly believed, on some deep level, that he would be caught. He had believed himself clever enough to evade suspicion, had believed that Eleanor Fitton's obvious guilt and his own careful positioning as an observer rather than a participant would allow him to escape consequences. This belief, he now recognized, had been a profound self-deception, a failure of psychological realism that had cost him everything. As Miss Marple prepared to depart, Richard asked her a question that seemed to have been troubling him. He asked whether she had, at any point during the investigation, suspected him directly, or whether her suspicions had emerged only after the evidence regarding the forged letters had created the necessary framework for reinterpretation. Miss Marple answered with careful honesty. She explained that she had suspected his capacity for such a crime, had recognized in his psychological presentation the indicators of someone capable of violence under sufficient internal pressure. Yet she had not possessed evidence sufficient to voice these suspicions as anything more than intuitive speculation. She had proceeded with caution because she had learned through many years of village observation that the difference between accurate insight and baseless prejudgment was often distressingly thin, and that acting upon intuition without corroborating evidence could result in grave injustice. Richard nodded slowly, as though absorbing this explanation, and then he thanked Miss Marple for her visit with evident sincerity. Miss Marple's journey home from the county prison was undertaken in a state of profound quiet reflection. The winter landscape through the carriage window, bare trees, grey skies, the distinctive architecture of English villages passing in succession, seemed to mirror her internal emotional state. She had sought answers from Richard Ashford, had hoped that direct conversation with the perpetrator of the crime might illuminate some final truth that had eluded her despite the investigation's comprehensive resolution. Yet what she had encountered instead was a man confronting the terrible consequences of his actions, a man whose psychological self-deception had been finally stripped away by the inexorable reality of incarceration. This was perhaps the most important truth she had discovered, that Richard's crime had not emerged from clarity of thought or rational calculation, but from a profound failure of psychological realism, from the inability of someone trapped in psychological captivity to accurately envision the consequences of violent escape. She returned to Little Paddleton in the grey twilight of a January evening, the village emerging from the gathering darkness with its familiar outlines. The church spire, the high street with its shuttered shops, the distant outline of Hazel door visible on the hillside. The estate had been sold in December to a London family seeking a country residence, and new furnishings and decorations had already begun to transform its interior, though the external architecture remained unchanged, bearing its history like an indelible scar. Miss Marple's housekeeper, Mrs. Weatherby, had prepared a warm fire and hot tea in anticipation of her return, and as Miss Marple settled into her familiar chair in the garden room, she experienced the particular gratitude that comes from returning to one's own space after a difficult journey. She picked up her knitting, the familiar needles and wool providing both occupation and comfort, and allowed her mind to settle into the contemplative state that had become increasingly her natural condition in these later years. Over the following weeks, as winter gradually gave way to spring, Miss Marple found herself becoming increasingly involved in the ordinary rhythms of village life. She attended church services with her customary regularity, participated in the parish meetings that organized the village's charitable and social activities, and maintained her regular tea gatherings with the small circle of elderly women who had been her companions for decades. Yet something had shifted in her engagement with these activities, a subtle difference in her awareness that she struggled to articulate precisely. She found herself observing the village with an intensity of attention that bordered on farewell, as though she were cataloguing the familiar patterns of village life for some future reference that she might not herself be present to consult. It was Mrs. Weatherby who first noticed this change, and who gently broached the subject with Miss Marple one afternoon in February. The housekeeper asked whether Miss Marple was experiencing any decline in her health, or whether she harbored concerns that prompted her seemingly new intensity of observation. Miss Marple, appreciating the housekeeper's perceptiveness, acknowledged that she had indeed begun to contemplate her own mortality with increasing frequency. She explained that the Catherine Ashford case had served as a kind of catalyst, forcing her to acknowledge that her time in Little Paddleton, while potentially extensive, was ultimately finite. She had begun to recognize that the accumulation of knowledge about human nature that she had gathered over 7 decades represented a kind of responsibility, not an obligation to continue solving murders or investigating crimes, but rather an obligation to distill her understanding into some form that might persist beyond her own continued existence. By spring, as the village gardens began their annual resurrection and the cycle of life reasserted itself with characteristic indifference to human drama, Miss Marple had made a decision regarding the disposition of her personal papers and journals. She had, over many decades, maintained detailed records of village events, family histories, and her own observations regarding the patterns of human behavior that she had observed. She arranged for these materials to be preserved in the care of the parish church, with the understanding that they would be available for future historical research regarding village life and social patterns. This act of documentation and preservation seemed to bring her a particular kind of peace, a recognition that her observations, even if they were not recorded in the sensational form of criminal investigation, possessed value as a record of how ordinary people actually live their lives within the constraints and opportunities provided by small community existence. On a particularly beautiful afternoon in late April, David Ashford visited Miss Marple at her cottage. The young man, who had now established himself securely in his village position and who had developed a genuine, if still somewhat tentative, relationship with his mother Eleanor, had expressed a desire to thank Miss Marple personally for her role in ensuring that his mother had not been falsely convicted of murder. As they sat in the garden room, with spring sunlight streaming through the windows and the garden beyond, displaying its annual profusion of bloom, David spoke with evident gratitude about how his life might have been entirely different had Eleanor been convicted and imprisoned. He acknowledged the peculiar mercy that Miss Marple's intervention had represented, not merely in terms of Eleanor's personal fate, but in terms of the possibility of genuine connection between mother and son that had emerged from the investigation's resolution. Miss Marple, listening to David's account of his developing relationship with Eleanor and of the gradual construction of genuine familial bonds despite their late introduction to one another, felt a particular kind of satisfaction. This satisfaction did not erase the tragedy that had occurred or the violence that had been committed, but it represented a small instance of redemption emerging from the wreckage of the crime. As spring progressed into early summer, and as Little Paddleton settled into its familiar patterns once again, Miss Marple found herself at peace with the resolution of the case in a way that had previously eluded her. She recognized that perfect justice did not exist in human affairs, that crimes created consequences that reverberated through communities in ways that legal processes could never entirely repair or resolve. Yet she also recognized that truth, when accurately identified and properly articulated, possessed a certain power to mitigate suffering and to allow genuine human connection to emerge from the devastation wrought by deception and violence. She had contributed what she could to the pursuit of truth in the Catherine Ashford case, and now, as she settled into her later years with increasing contentment, she allowed herself to believe that this contribution had been sufficient and that her role in the village's dramas, while perhaps not entirely concluded, had at least entered a new and quieter phase.